Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comet Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Laverton. Welcome to Conversing. I'm so excited again to be able to have Pete Docter back as a guest on Conversing. Pete has been on our show before discussing other films that he's made, films like Monsters, Inc. and Up and Inside Out and Soul, all films that have made their way in the world with great acclaim and with great box office success. His interest in animation began when he was just an 8-year-old little boy and created his first flip book, which is a tradition that he and his family still maintain to this day around Christmas time. But it was the beginning of his career in animation, and by 1990, he had joined Pixar, a newly established studio, and became its, in fact, third animator. He also collaborated and helped develop the story and the characters for Toy Story, Pixar's first full-length animated film, and one of those that most defines Pixar and most defines Pete's own work. He served as a storyboard artist on films like A Bug's Life, and he wrote initial story treatments for Toy Story 2 and Wall-E, and has directed other great films. So today I'm excited to have an opportunity to talk with Pete about the most recent film that's just opened, Inside Out 2. Welcome, Pete. So glad to have you.
It's great to be here, Mark. Thanks for having me.
You know, I just smile at the very thought of getting to talk to you about another Pixar movie, not least Inside Out 2, which has just been released and which I've seen twice and which I just find another remarkable achievement of Pixar. So let me just start by unguardedly saying I'm all in on the whole Inside Out project,
cool.
1 and 2. And but this time it's a different story with lots of continuity, but also lots of discontinuity, which is exactly the point of the film. And this time you are the executive producer, not the director. So I'm very excited to talk to you about the film and about your own perception of this as a person who's inside it in every way, and yet also in your own way outside it in a different role. So Pete, let's just start with just comment for those who may or may not have seen Inside Out. Let's just start by having you comment on what that is, what it was about, and then how Inside Out 2 has this continuity-discontinuity theme.
Sure. Yeah, Inside Out is about a little girl, but she's not the main character. She's the setting, because inside her head are her emotions, which are anger, fear, sadness, disgust, and joy, driving her and helping her make decisions through the day. And the fun of that, of course, was to unpack little scenes like having dinner. The outward conversation is so different from what's all the complexity of going on inside her head. So in the first film, Riley, the protagonist slash setting, had moved from Minnesota to a new location, which is San Francisco, and is dealing with all the trauma of loss, of moving. In this film, I had asked Kelsey Mann, who's the director, to just play around a little bit with some ideas, because it felt like people kept coming to us with stories of how the first film had affected them.
Yes.
And so we said, well, let's play around. And he had this idea of bringing anxiety into the picture. Because, of course, we chose 5 emotions in the first movie, somewhat, not arbitrarily, but some psychologists theorized there are 27 different emotions.
Right.
And so we had a lot to pick from for this movie.
Right. Well, anxiety was a key one. And part of this is, of course, completely concurrent because the story tracks Riley becoming an adolescent and entering puberty and everything else that goes along with that.
Yes. I mean, it's funny actually to talk about this with words, because as I pitched the movie initially, people would kind of cock their head and squint their eyes because it doesn't translate into words. That you have to see it.
Yes.
A lot of the complexity of this is only made possible because we were able to visualize some of this stuff.
Right. Which is one of the reasons why I think Inside Out had such impact, because it took something that is very visceral and bodily and known to us, and at the same time invisible in its source and its power. So to have it become visual and, in that sense, semi-physical almost is really quite a remarkable achievement. So one of the things that happens in the film is that the film establishes the continuity and helps us go back and remember a bit about what the first film was.
Yeah.
But it also quite seamlessly and beautifully starts then picking up in that continuity until the moment where suddenly puberty breaks in, and
Right.
and dramatically so in the film. I'll try to not say things that are unnecessary to say about the film for those who haven't seen it.
Spoilers, yeah.
But there's just a dramatic way that suddenly it arrives. And there were several things about the film and its technique that I thought were amazing, and I just wanted you to comment on a couple of them. Mm-hmm. One has to do with the fact that the emotions themselves, that are the new emotions, which tell us what those are.
Well, the primary one is anxiety, and she's basically the protagonist. And then along with her are other socially connective emotions, like envy, of course, is the desire for something someone else has, and embarrassment, and ennui, which is boredom. So they're all really fun to dramatize and very familiar for those of us who have teenagers.
Yes,
those emotions.
Yeah, absolutely. I did think about the teenagers in your life and in our life in the past, and the teenagers that are also present, of course, in the lives of the director and others that were involved in it, I'm sure. So one of the things that happens is that you manifest these emotions in ways that are really captivating. When you look at Riley, it's interesting that a couple things happen and then don't happen that I wanted to ask you about.
Okay.
So one of the things that happens is a changing body, and there's this really quite amazing moment where Riley puts on some clothing which no longer fits her.
Yeah.
Which is just symbolically and every other way wonderful, because it's in part saying the emotions that she had before and the color correspondence between the sweater that doesn't fit her anymore and those emotions.
Yeah.
Means she's outgrown the form of emotion or the nature of the emotion that was true. That's just a fun, interesting little physical thing. But one of the things that I also thought was remarkable was how seamlessly and unnoticeably, if you don't happen to look in this direction, a pimple appears on her chin,
mm-hmm.
and it was a masterpiece, I thought, partly because it's just so suggestive without developing into a full-blown case of acne. But
Yeah.
it's clearly signaling in a rather quiet way the physical changes that are going on.
Yeah, and that was something that Kelsey Mann, the director, was big on from the beginning.
Uh-huh.
He would say, we were so used to seeing characters represented in this perfect, idealized way.
Yes.
And yet, when we look at the mirror,
Yes.
we realize,
Yes.
hey, I don't measure up to that. So and that was kind of the message of the film from the beginning, is learning to accept yourself, the flaws and all, because that's so much of our civilization is measuring ourselves against others, and especially that period in time growing
Yes.
up.
Right.
You're suddenly socially aware and where you fit in or don't.
Yes. Well, and there's this moment early in the film where we're going back and looking at at groups of people that have been influential in Riley's life, emotionally speaking, and it's moved from having family being the dominant one to friends being the dominant one, the social reality, which is,
Right.
of course, exactly what the teenage years are about.
Yeah.
Predominantly. When you think about the role of anxiety, who is really the protagonist, she does really become this character that is like all of these emotions. They are actually friends. They love Riley. They are seeking the welfare of Riley, but anxiety does it in a particularly neurotic way, which is exactly what anxiety can often feel like. That
Yes.
It's just driving us. Comment on what you saw developing in anxiety's character.
Yeah. I mean, as you say, all the emotions and all of our emotions are there for a good reason.
Yes.
They're positive. They want to help. And a little anxiety is good.
Yes.
Lisa Lamore, who was a consultant on the film, her big thing is like all of society is saying, get rid of emotion. It's awful.
Yes.
It's evil. It's not true.
Right.
We want a little. We want to be able to worry about the test tomorrow or
Right.
be concerned about what so-and-so thinks about us. Those make us better people. But too much, and it gets turned up. I mean, yeah, doing the research was key for all the characters, and it really became defining in how we wrote for them, even how we designed them to some degree, because knowing what those drivers are, in the case of anger, it's fairness.
Yes.
When you feel like somebody crossed you, you get angry. For anxiety, of course, it's, as she explains in the film, fear protects her from the things she can see, like
Right.
a dog jumping out at you, you react in fear, versus anxiety, planning for the future, thinking about things that may go wrong so you can hopefully avoid them or maybe spin into a spiral of anxiety, which is, of course, what happens to a lot of us.
Yes. One of the things that struck me was the way that the character of anxiety becomes so subtly, and then of course not at all subtly, controlling of the character of Riley, and how letting it have its own head in that way is a very, very powerful and understandable thing, especially for a teenager. But I also thought that it was interesting how the other emotions both learned from and received that. I mean, it wasn't altogether easy, but they understood the value and were learning themselves from what anxiety was thickening about Riley's experience of the world and life and the friends that are around her. I guess I was curious, were there other emotions that almost made it in that didn't make it into this one?
Yeah. We went through the whole list. Awkwardness would be very fun. One that we tried in both the first film and in this film is Schadenfreude, which is, of course, the taking pleasure in other people's pain.
Yes.
And we had I thought it was a pretty funny gag where fear gets banged on the head and Schadenfreude says, "Your cries of pain amuse me." Of course, has a German accent, of course. This is the fascinating thing about the whole process of making these is that by constantly allowing the story to drive, hopefully, you start to winnow some of those decisions.
Yes.
Schadenfreude really doesn't have a lot to do with becoming socially aware. And
Right.
so we said, all right, that's not as important. And so you cut it out of the movie. So anyway, there were a lot of experiments for sure.
Right. Pete, one of the things that puberty brings about, of course, is physical changes. And I thought it was interesting and to some degree noteworthy that wasn't really explored in the film overtly. Was that since everything in a Pixar film is literally intentional, it only gets there or doesn't get there by active decision making. What was the decision about not showing, for example, body development or changes?
Well, of course, we do have the scene that you pointed out of the shirt not fitting,
Yes.
but more or less the film takes place over the course of 3 days. So you're kind of limited by that. And really, as we got into it, we recognized that the central thing we're talking about here is the anxiety,
Right.
which is really not directly related to puberty. So even though it's a funny gag, and we'll hopefully get a joke out of the alarm and the characters even mispronouncing what's puberty, they don't know what they're in for. That's kind of background really to the idea of self-loathing and self-acceptance and all the things that we explore in the film. And of course, you also mentioned Joy as a character. Joy in the first film, I've sort of caricatured as, oh, goody, candy. She's very excited. She's very enthusiastic. And our hope in this film was that we could evolve her and develop her into something much richer and deeper and more gratitude-based. And that's also, there was a lot of fun exploring that, as well as just other aspects of her. We get to see her angry, which we never did in the first film, and concerned and kind of lose track of where she needs to go. Joy has always been a character who's so driven and so sure of herself. And so that was a lot of fun too.
The reason I was asking about the body piece is that, when I think about puberty, that's the first place my mind goes, is not the emotions, but it's actually like body development. The fact that, it's partly because I entered puberty super early and was 6'2", as perhaps you were by the time I was 12. So therefore, it was prominent on my own developmental history.
I had this long, stretched out puberty where I was 6'4", maybe 100 pounds, and my voice did not change until 11th grade. So I was this. I think that's again maybe why I got into animation, because I was a walking cartoon character, you know. But yeah, as we did explore that, and I think Kelsey said, okay, when you asked me, Pete, what do I want to see in this movie? I want to see that puberty button go off.
Yes.
I want to see other emotions.
Yes.
There were certain things that he started to explore.
Yeah.
But we pretty quickly realized, I mean, I set this out in the first film, that I don't want this to be set in the brain.
Yes. Right.
So it's not in the body, it's in the mind. It's an abstraction of our body in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, we don't want to get into blood flow and hormones and things like that.
Yeah.
Because we don't have characters that really represent that. So it became kind of backdrop to the anxiety of it.
Got it. Yes. Well, there is that moment later in the film where it's Joy who actually takes away her lesser developed self, her younger self, and puts in its place an acceptance and invitation to the fullness of who Riley is becoming as she's maturing through these experiences and emotions that are unfolding. It's a very substantial part of the film, I think.
Well, it was a lot of, I mean, the gift of this idea, this concept of inside the head, is that it allows us to talk about what's probably the most important thing in our lives. It's like, who are we?
Yes.
What are the things that make us who we are? Is it just our experiences, our beliefs, our actions that we take?
Yes.
You know, and all of those start to get folded into the film. I guess in a way, it's a theme that I've been playing with for a while. It's kind of at the heart of Soul as well.
Right.
That's I actually let me clarify for a minute. You mentioned, so as you mentioned, I'm not the director of the film. I'm exec producer, which is a slippery, weird title. In this case, of course, I was helping Kelsey to be authentic and truthful to the first film, which he definitely wanted. But then we had this occurrence, the actor strike.
Right, yes.
Right in the middle of everything. And of course, the way we work is you go to the actor, you record them, you get their voice, and then the animators animate to that. And we had this just giant stop to everything.
Yes.
And so when it finally lifted, we were so far behind that I ended up sitting in and kind of co-directing in certain areas with Kelsey. He's still the lead guy, but I was able to help out which was great. It was a great gift for me because being in this other role of the chief creative officer, I see things a little bit more from a distance. And yet, I don't know, for me, the creative process is all about the nitty gritty details. And so being able to get back in there and work in editorial and help craft the last third of the film is kind of where I was focused, is on the last, the sort of climax of the thing. So.
Yeah. Well, it's a great climax. And in the way that I think Disney, in a different way, and Pixar especially, has done, it doesn't sidestep hard and complexifying issues of life. And so there's an incredible thickening of what it means to be a person, of what it means for Riley to be Riley, and what these emotions actually help her to accomplish and understand and mature, which is at least a key part of most storytelling.
Yeah, it was, if anything, it's too complex. That was a large portion of our job in the last 9 months or so, is simplifying the story down so that people don't need a degree in psychology to be able to understand the movie.
Yes.
As I say, a lot of that I think is done visually. You have these symbols that represent ideas, and you have to go get them and put them in certain places. And so that's a big help.
Yeah. Speaking of the complexity, let me ask you this. I was curious, as it was getting more and more complex as the film was going on, I was wondering about whether, when you're working on a film like this, obviously you have target audiences, and I would presume, well, let me not presume. What would you say is the primary target audience of this film?
Me. It's really, when we sit in editorial, I'm not thinking about kids or adults or whatever. I'm just making something that I would enjoy and that I understand and that I'm moved by, because I think ultimately as I analyze, like, why do we go to movies? It's to test run all the equipment to make us feel,
Yes.
And so if we don't feel, then it's a pretty boring movie. It doesn't mean we have to cry. We just have to engage in some way, whether we're scared or entertained or whatever that is.
Right.
So really, that's just what I'm trying to do, is for us in that room, as we're making it, are we engaged? Are we emotional
Right.
in some way? And then
Right.
we show it. We have this whole process, which I know we've talked about in other podcasts, of showing it to other people, kind of
Yes.
testing it out.
Right,
So
right.
by the time the movie comes out, we've made the entire movie at least 8-9 times.
Wow.
In an effort to focus and craft and refine
Right.
what we're talking about. There was an early version where you were talking about other emotions. We had shame and guilt as antagonists that were the sort of baddies that were covering for the true bad character of anxiety.
Yes.
And that was really interesting, but it got very, very complicated.
Yes.
Of course, the difference between guilt and shame. Shame is when you do something that you regret and you want to hide it,
Yes.
cover it up, versus guilt, which drives you hopefully to apologize and to change the mistakes. So that was really interesting, but it did get more complex.
Right. I'm sure it would have.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do want to pause for a minute and comment on We, which, first of all, when I just heard that there was a character called Ennui for this film, I couldn't have been happier, because it felt to me like part of the pixie dust of Pixar is that ability to find the thing that's going to hook. And somehow Ennui felt like exactly the right word. And then the way that the character is developed is so familiar when I think about teenagers I've been with and our own kids, and certainly the experience of living in and around Berkeley, California, with lots of teenagers and early adults for whom ennui is always a ready and present tool for
It's so
deflection.
funny. And you think back and like, why is that? I remember being a kid and thinking, I can't show them too much enthusiasm because that's so uncool.
Exactly.
I don't know why that is.
Exactly.
Kind of the opposite we struggle with now as adults. I think it's the opposite. So
Yes. Well, there's a conference I once spoke at where, as is typical of some of the family conferences that occur, there's a talent show, and in the talent show, this newlywed couple, the groom of the newlywed couple, the husband, came forward and said, many of you were at our wedding, and you know that at the wedding I sang to my bride, and so I'd really like to sing to my bride again. I'm thinking, oh no, this is not a good idea. And so he gets a chair, sits her down in the middle of the circle, and gets down on one knee and sings this completely unguardedly earnest love song to his new bride. And I'm sitting there thinking, I'm looking around, anticipating seeing eye rolling, forehead rubbing, looking away gestures. But this Midwestern crowd just looked straight on. And as he sang, many, many people started to cry. And I just sat there thinking of myself, heart of darkness, like, where is Colbert when you need him? That sort of a response, which was a sign I'd lived in Berkeley too long. But it was an example to me of the complexity of emotion, right? And this feeling of a culture that accepts emotion, which that one certainly did. This was earnest emotion. It just came as unguardedly as it could have into the middle of a several hundred person conference, and everyone received it. And when I was watching, I kept thinking, this is really such an important story because of how emotions do complexify, how social dynamics create a guardedness, rails that we may or may not always want to have in place, but which we might need to at least come to understand in our teenage years, if not later. And I think all that gets captured really, really well.
Well, thank you. I think, one of the animators that I learned from who animated on Snow White, and, he was one of Disney's 9 old men, if you're familiar with that term.
Right.
He would always talk about sincerity being the key. And as growing up, of course, you're like, no, it's all about drawing. How well can you draw or move something, or all the technique,
Yes, right.
For him, that was background. And once you get that under your belt, obviously that's essential. You need to have those skills. But I think finding the sincerity, finding the truth of character,
Yes.
even though you might cringe for a moment, I think people can feel that.
Right.
People can feel when someone is trying to affect you and being manipulative versus finding the sincerity. And, that's always tough because this stuff is made one frame at a time
Right.
over the course of 4 or 5 years. So to preserve that sense of freshness is tough.
It's very tough, I'm sure. Often in Pixar films, I know you've spoken about before, there are technological challenges that you've set yourself for the film.
Oh, yeah.
So what were some of the technological challenges you were working on in this film?
Well, it's funny. Sometimes they change things for very good reason, and it undoes other things. So when we started on this one, we thought, we'll just unpack joy and sadness and all the others from the back lot and, bring them out of the computer memory and start up again. Well, they had changed the software such that we could no longer render the characters. So,
Oh my gosh.
not on purpose, of course. And there were a lot of great things, innovations that came out of this new upgrade that you've seen in some of the other films.
Right.
But it did mean we had to go back and kind of refigure out new ways to do what we did 9 years ago.
Wow.
Let me think. I mean, a lot of the effects work, I think, is pretty stunning in this movie.
There's a lot of amazing effects work.
Yeah, and again, the cool thing is that it's there to represent the way we feel.
Yes. Yes.
And so that was, really fun. We also, I think, Kelsey early on made the choice to widen the screen. So the original was 185. This is 239. So it's a widescreen film, which is all the more reason to see it in the theater.
Yes.
And there's some brilliant effects work and very visceral, big kind of stuff that was not as... We didn't explore that as much in the first film.
Yes.
And that was a way to separate this one and go into new grounds. Because, of course, when you do a sequel, I think people are wanting what they saw before.
Right.
But they also want to be surprised and not just repeat what they saw before. So that's
Exactly.
always the balance with this stuff.
Yeah. I didn't go back and rewatch Inside Out to see whether this same feature was true in it or not. But one of the things that stood out to me was the treatment that were given literally to Riley's eyes. And it seemed to me, correct me if I'm like overdoing this, but it seemed to me that the way her eyes are used is one of the most sophisticated and subtle pieces of the way we see her bodily express these complex emotions. And the nuances of her eyes gave almost a like it was itself an emotional experience to see her face, and those eyes especially contain the subtlety and the power of that. There's an incident that occurs early with her mother, for example, that's a very, very telling one. There's another moment when they're on the ice rink where she's torn up between two choices, and her eyes at that particular moment. But also later in the film, when she's coming to understand through her emotions about what anxieties do and don't matter to her, there's a particularly distilled moment where that happens. So was that something different from the first film, or am I just overinterpreting things here?
No, I think what's happened is that our animators they've gotten better and better and better.
Yeah.
And we keep building on what we've learned from past films. Some of that, of course, is let me just back up. I know for some viewers, it confuses people to think of computer animation. They think of it as like somebody draws it or something.
Yeah.
Which for us, it's a little bit more like a puppet, where you have these characters and you can move. If you have controls, you can pull points, you can rotate, you can stretch. So the eyes have been something we've been incredibly focused on since the first Toy Story.
Yes.
But it's largely the great observational skills of the animators that are cluing in on very subtle details, which of course we as human beings, that's where you spend 90% of your time is looking at other people's eyes. So it's
Right.
really key. Very key. The other thing we realized in the storytelling from the first film was if you show Riley sad and then you zip in her head and there's sadness saying, oh, this is sad, you kind of got nothing.
Yeah, right.
We have to do something different or surprising from the in to the outside worlds. And so it was very important, obviously, to be able to represent that with Riley.
I'm Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me. One of the great things about Pixar films is the use of music and the significance of music in helping to tell the story. Tell us how that was used and developed in relationship to Inside Out 2.
I'm always struck by how music is this, again, kind of like emotions, really, this unconscious communicator.
Yes.
And working with Andrea Datzman, who's the composer, and her husband, Michael Giacchino, he wrote the music for the first one. And one of the great joys is going to the scoring stage. And that's usually towards the end of the process for us. So all the hard work has been done and it's either good or bad, but either way, we don't worry about the story anymore.
Right.
And now we just get to see these amazing craftspeople come in. I swear, these musicians have no idea what they're going to play. They show up, they got their violin or whatever. They sit down. Usually they kind of cursory look at the score and then start doing a crossword or something. And then as soon as, all right, let's pick up score 3M7 and measure 56. And they'd be like, they can play anything, sight reading.
Right.
And even more remarkably, when it doesn't work, and by that I mean, obviously the music is all designed, written to affect you in a specific way and say something about the character.
Sure.
I'll give you just an example. When Riley sees this older girl, Val, who's the team captain
Yes.
of the hockey team, everybody is in total awe of this older kid. And there was a worry that it might come off as romantic because she sees this girl in sort of an upshot with the light behind her,
Yes.
and it could read that way, but that was not our intention in this case. And so musically, Andrea put in French horns. And I know that seems like, what? But as soon as you hear that, it's like a regal sound.
Right.
It says something about how she feels about this character.
Yes.
Just through the choice of instrumentation.
Yes,
And
yes.
there are millions
It's a
and
great
millions
example.
of little tricks that they have up their sleeves. And it's amazing because they're so fast too.
Yes, yes.
We've been making these movies one frame at a time over the last 4 years. And then you go down to the scoring stage and within hours, this brilliance, and usually, of course, you start with something written.
Yes.
But then they start listening and adjusting and let's drop this and thin this. And
Yes.
it's a
Wow.
real thrill.
Well, it's such a key feature of Pixar films because the whole arts, in a way, you bring to the table is rich and meaningful and really profound in its professionalism and its beauty, but also in its meaning and how that actually does shape the experience of the viewer.
I mean, that's been the thing you realize. I think any artist like you, everything at your disposal has the potential of saying something.
Yes, yes.
And whether you design it that way or not, it probably will
Right.
say something. In some cases, that's the fun of it, is that you want to leave it more ambiguous, leave it
Yes.
for the audience to interpret.
Yes.
And other times, you can be very intentional. And that's, the joy of the craft of it is huge for me. So
Huge, understandably so. The beauty of the film is really quite striking. I mean, there's so many just visually beautiful scenes and the use of light, the use of again, the way that the belief system, which is a dimension of this particular film, that's really quite important. The beauty of that, the way that connects to ultimately to emotions and back and forth, all of that. Then the way that the storyline, I'll call it, pollutes the belief system, and then how all that has to get resorted again. It is an example of the complexity of the film, but it's also an example of what makes it so substantial in what I think it's trying to accomplish.
Well, that was, again, one of the great joys of working on these is that you get to unpack things that are otherwise on automatic. And really, that was a striking thing. We talked with Dr. Paul Ekman early on in the first film. He's one of the pioneers in facial expressions.
Yes.
And he talked about emotions as being largely under the hood. In other words, unconscious. So stuff happens, you react. You didn't choose to do that. You didn't even think about it. And in fact, most of the time it passes by without you're ever being conscious of it. You know, it arises and passes away without you ever being like, oh, I was angry because this person did, you know what I mean? It's just an automatic system. So to unpack all this stuff and think more deeply about who are we? Why do we believe certain things? I guess our thought was that it's primarily driven by experience. So the memories come in, those, we represented them as little kind of like bowling balls with moving images in the middle.
Right.
And then, you know, I think obviously everybody's different. So there's some sort of God-given hardwiring in there that makes you do things differently. But a large part of it is, what do we do every day? We are what we do again and again. And so that was something we were trying to represent in the film as well.
Right. Well, that comes through very clearly. And part of her own development, Riley's own development, has to do with the way that the emotions help her come to terms with some compromises she had made, some second guessing that she had done, the questions of how is she going to recover what she had, in a way, walked away from, or not been paying attention to, at least. And all of that, again, is grounded in bodily elements, but also in these emotional elements that are so informative to how she's developing. And then the way that that's socialized with her closest friends is really amazing.
Yeah, it's been fun. I mean, since I did Soul, you know, I think we talked about it's really more Greek.
Yes.
Philosophy of this dualism of, well, we have a body and we have a soul, and someday we're going to die and the body will die away and the soul goes on. That's not like a Christian it's very Greek. It's a Western idea. And the more I live, the less I trust that.
Right.
As, you know, you start to experience, well, wait a minute, we're all so embodied, you know, all these things that we think of as ethereal or abstract really come to the fore because they are embodied, because they exist in some way that we can touch and interact with and experience. You know?
Right.
And so that was, I guess I don't know if that's what Kelsey was talking about at all in the film, but for me, as we started to build things, that's been a thought tumbling through my head.
Yeah. Well, a lot of theologians use the language that we are body souls. And I think that is trying to hold these themes together in the way you're describing. We can't really talk about ourselves as though we are these disparate entities that coexist in a body accidentally or incidentally, rather. And instead, it's really a much more colliding, intertwined, inseparable reality. Yeah.
But I was listening to a podcast, a woman was talking about incarnation and the fact that we often limit incarnation as it's just Christmas. But really, you think of the world as incarnate in some way, and that God is in everything. And I just find that profound and beautiful and kind of mind expanding in a really healthy way.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's part of a dualism that is, I think, having to be overcome, partly because we've come to understand so much more about the body, and partly because we've come to understand so much more about neuroscience that has given us a much, much greater picture of the complexity of the brain and the instrumentality of the brain in all of its incredible layering and richness. Pete, one of the things that I just want to say is that there's an amazing amount of goodness that Pixar has injected into the world. And it would be hard for me to think of a single source of more good that has been injected into the world through a human agency, other than I would wish to say the church, but I will say is true of Pixar, and I say that soberly, really, because I say it with huge gratitude, enormous respect for what is being done, an ability to be multilingual, and by that I mean you're not speaking a language that requires a person having to buy the whole package or to accept everything that you're saying. And yet that doesn't create a decision on Pixar's part to be vacuous about a sense of values, a sense of what it means to be human. And at a time when so many things, including AI, but many other things, are throwing in question what our identity as human beings actually is, and what our capacities are, and what our knowledge is, and what our embodied life means, it's all the more important to me that Pixar is doing the work that it's doing. And I do see, not alone, because I know that Pixar is very much a combined shared entity.
Absolutely, yes.
And I underscore that. But I also have to say that it feels to me, knowing you, that it has an aroma that I recognize as related to you in a particularly strong way, and for me in a very, very positive way.
Wow, thank you very much. That's a big compliment, and I'm daily reminding myself how lucky I am, how fortunate I am to be in this position, to be able to. I do feel like there's the eternal struggle of like figuring out what is it that I'm meant to be doing with the time that I have.
Yes.
And there is a sort of a daily sense of, I'm in the right lane here.
Right.
Sometimes not. Sometimes there are days when I'm like, should I just be building cabinets or something, but
Right.
But there's a real reward to when it clicks. And I'm very, very lucky to have found all these other weirdos like myself that will spend 5 years making an alternate reality that will hopefully entertain people for an hour and a half.
Right. And it does way more than that. I was reminded, again, in watching this, I recently had a chance to interview Maui Askadom, who you've met, and who has found Inside Out such an inspiration that he's now built a whole complex educational system for social emotional education for children that tries to, in a parallel way, create characters that help children understand their own development emotionally,
Wow.
but also in other ways, right?
Wow,
And
that's a tough one.
it is a really significant challenge.
Yeah.
And it's just getting launched, but it seems to be making great headway.
Oh,
and
that's
I think there's
fantastic.
been many, many, many other things that have been hugely inspired by the work of a lot of your films, but certainly the idea of emotion, which is so central to storytelling and so central to Pixar's storytelling, is obviously a key theme in how we come to understand that, because it does feel like the thing that in many ways most affects how we live, and yet it may seem like the most elusive, the most uncontrollable, which they are actually are not, but which
Right.
can nevertheless feel that way. So yeah, it
Yeah.
is a story of helping people grow up and mature and deepen and be and do good that is not saccharine, it's not superficial, it's not pretend.
Wow, thank you. We were very lucky to, every film we do, the cast has a huge effect. And this one, I would say doubly so. Working with Amy Poehler, she is just an amazing writer, performer. She's such a giving person to be around. A lot of times, especially with actors, I think, you realize, okay, I'm on, I gotta
Yes.
give it my 100% focus. And Amy has this very selfless, like she listens and laughs at you. And suddenly you feel like, I made Amy Poehler laugh. Oh my gosh, this is amazing. And it makes you better.
Right,
And so
of course.
she's just such a wonderful person to be around. We got to work with Tony Hale, who I think has been on your podcast as well, right? As Fear in this one. So that was fantastic, and such
Yes,
an
yes.
amazing actor.
He
So,
is so
it
incredible.
just from top to bottom, the cast really helped shape. And the other thing I'll say, much like doing the research for why do we have anger? Why do we have sadness? What's the purpose? Once we cast them, the actors have a huge effect, because we start to listen to what they do well and where their center of, what skills do they have?
Yes.
What words do they use,
Yes.
even off mic, that we can start to shape the character and tailor it to almost like a suit. You're taking the shoulders a little bit. And,
Yes.
so it's a lot of fun.
So Pete, an example of that very point is Maya Hawke, who is the voice for anxiety. And she does such a remarkable job. And
Yeah.
and of course, instantaneously wins you in with trepidation because you know you're in for a wild ride, and it becomes clear that this is an untamed creature, as it were.
Yes.
Which is exactly how anxiety feels. Tell us about how she influenced the development of that character.
Well, the anxiety, a little like joy. So in the first film, we, as I say, we do multiple versions, and we were on version 5 or 6, and people would say, they would watch the movie and they'd say, I love this movie. I hate your main character. She's so annoying. She's so happy all the time. And so when we worked with Amy, she said, okay, yeah, I think I can help you. She was very self-aware of how to take attributes which could be like make your teeth hurt and make them entertaining.
Yes.
And of course,
yes.
she's done that in many other projects, Parks and Rec and things like this. With anxiety, it was a similar but different problem where to really represent what anxiety feels like, there were versions of the film where people were like, it's only the end of Act 1 and already my heart is, I can't take anymore, you know?
Right.
So we had to, and Maya was amazing at finding the humor and I think another key to it is just finding a bunch of notes. So it's not just the same thing again and again. And she does even lines that were kind of evil sounding, she would bring a sensitivity and a reminder that, hey, I'm just trying to help.
Yes. That's part of that earnestness again, right?
Yeah.
The character, especially that our emotions are really on our team. Mm-hmm. They're trying to be on our team. And then it takes a maturing self to know what to make of these emotions, how to contextualize them, how to respond to them, how to let them inform us and not dominate us. And,
I mean, it is surprising. I don't know if you have this where, like, if you just stop yourself at some point in the day and go, what am I feeling right now? How often I'll be like, oh, I have a slight kind of cramp in my stomach. Why is that?
Right.
And then you can unfold it into a bunch of different things that, you know, are just otherwise just happen to you.
Yes.
And of course, that is emotions, as we talked about, are invisibly chugging along there to try to help us. But once in a while, it's pretty cool to just kind of stop and try to figure them out a little bit.
Yes. I've been working on a book on fear, and so the time that I've spent reading about it, trying to understand the nature of fear, the way that it functions, the way that fear functions in my own life, since I could tell the story of my life partly through the lens of fear. I could certainly tell it through the lens of other emotions as well, but that would be a significant one for me. And because we're living in an era where fear seems to be almost the dominant emotion, or anxiety, the dominant emotion of the era that we're living in, globally as well as nationally, as well as regionally and personally and politically and economically and so forth, it makes, I think, the readiness of this film, the audience readiness of receiving help on emotion at whatever age, a really, really timely one. I'm just wondering how that may have figured into the decision to make this film.
That was pretty key. When I tapped Kelsey to figure out some ideas, you know, we said, look, if we don't find anything, we won't make a sequel.
Yeah.
We're not committed to this. We have to have something that is engaging and has a strong enough core to it. When we were trying the first film, there was a period of a good year and a half where instead of joy being paired with sadness, she was paired with fear. And that was largely because, you know, for me in junior high, that was a huge part of who I was and continues to be. So that was definitely very resonant. And for Kelsey especially, I know he talked about finding photos of himself as a kid at his birthday. And here he is at 5 and he's smiling, and 6 and he's having a great time. And then you get to about 11 or 12 and he's getting more and more uncomfortable and does not like the focus of attention, doesn't feel he's worth it. And so that was largely at the core of where the film came from. I think it really speaks to all of us.
Right.
That sense of am I really worth it? You know.
Yes. When you think about this particular film through the lens of your own faith, Pete, what does your faith, how did it shape your perception of these questions, and how does this film in a way push your faith in directions that may be your own maturing process?
That's a good question. I mean, I sort of hinted at earlier the idea of being more connected to experience.
Yes.
I think for me, growing up Lutheran especially, there was a lot of intellectualization of concepts. And I always had this thought that if I could just have a week to myself, I could figure this stuff out once and for all and make my own manifesto of what I believe, and I'd be done.
Yes.
And then I think, working on films like this and just becoming interested, for me, it's been much more of, I want to experience this stuff. I think that's what makes it really deepen and connecting is a more, I guess I've really connected with the contemplative idea that we need to just, and I'm not saying this is the exclusive answer by any means. In fact, I love Richard Rohr has this Center for Action and Contemplation, which seem like such contrarian ideas, but as you get into it, you're like, oh yeah, that is, the more we kind of dig deeper into ourselves, the more we understand the greater, the sense of God and sense of the world. And so for me, that's been where I've been in the last couple of years, I guess.
Yeah. That makes great sense. Well, Pete, again, what an honor to have you, and what a joy to be able to talk about a film that I just know is going to touch the lives of literally millions and millions of people. And Pixar films have a very long shelf life. And one of the really great things is that in so many settings, you can talk about Inside Out as though it had just happened last week. Like it just came out. It's like asking somebody to tell you the story of their favorite teacher. They immediately spring to action and animation over what they have to say. And Inside Out certainly provoked that, as have many other Pixar films.
It's good to hear.
And
one other little bit of research we did that I was shocked by is that there's apparently a part of your brain that lights up, especially when you watch animation.
Is that right?
Why is that? Why? I don't know.
Wow.
But maybe that is part of the explanation of why we remember these things. I don't know.
Well, it may well be that. It's also, I've often thought about animation that it has the ability to move us in directions because it is animated and not live action. Mm-hmm. We can actually even look more straightforwardly at the thing that is being presented and allow it to have its full impact, because I'm not sorting out all the other things that are more distracting in live action films. Yeah. And it really is it's a very powerful form of communication.
Yeah, that's why I love it. And I think it's maybe why, we've got, and especially with Inside Out, we've had a lot of people with children who have autism.
Yes.
And they've said that the films have been very formative and helpful for them in understanding, because I think, as you say, it's our ability to take out all the extraneous stuff and turn up the volume on what it is that we're trying to communicate.
Right.
And maybe that's even, for me, just as a person, the world's a big, confusing place.
Yes.
Especially in my formative years, to be able to control this little, whatever it is, a movie, a little world that I'm building, is it's been rewarding. And I think has been one of the reasons I got into this, I guess.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations to you and the team for another spectacular success.
Thanks again, Mark.
And may it have far-reaching influence. So thanks, Pete. All the best.
Sure. Thank you. It was great.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Laberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Laberton. Thanks for listening with me.